Our CTO and co-founder is Swetabh Pathak, as well as Krutika Gaonkar, who's one of our senior solutions architects. And what we're going to do is explore, we've heard a lot about clinical up to this point, but we're going to talk a little bit more about preclinical data management for R&D. And they'll share with you today a data management strategy that allows R&D teams to ensure the journey for data generated from instruments, from CROs, to insight derivation. That whole journey is seamless. So with that, over to you, SP.
Thanks, Bobby. Krutika, if you can share this screen, we can get started. So this one, Krutika and I are going to run together. The first few slides I'm going to go over, and then Krutika will take over from me for running through a demo. So Fair Data Fair, thank you so much, everybody who has joined us. If we can go to the next slide. We're going to talk about preclinical data management, and to this point, we have covered the themes of if you've been with us so far all through, we've covered the themes of how to build data lakes, data mesh, how to make sure that your data is fair, what kind of principles are applied. For that, ours is this particular talk is going to be a little bit different. We're going to focus on one, preclinical data, to specifically talk about some case studies of managing this kind of data and showing what the benefits of having a platform for doing such a thing is. So on the next slide, we have a small run through of the agenda of what we're going to cover. And again, we have covered data journey in other slices through this conference. We're going to talk about that in the context of preclinical programs. What does that data roadmap look like? The diversity and volume of data generated in preclinical domain, again, that's different from the clinical domain, as you know, for example, what Giovanni was talking about just before this conversation. Next, we're going to look at a case study for drug screening studies in a therapeutics company. So we're going to run through that example and try to talk about why a platform approach is necessary for solving data management challenges that lead to conversation on data-centric platform. What does that look like? And finally, we're going to show a little bit of what we at Elucidata have made for preclinical teams. So with that, if we could move forward. This again, you know, the general structure is true for all sorts of industries, including ours. But there are some differences, right? And within biopharma, and especially in preclinical R&D, there are multiple stakeholders involved, and we're going to talk about at different points that different stakeholders require have different needs, have different concerns. And for example, like here, we talk about 4 of those personas. So bench scientists, these are the people who are generating the data. They're also often responsible for drawing insights from the data. And that's a tricky place to be in. One, because they're very close to the data, but they're very close to the data on a day-to-day basis. They don't think long-term about what is the use of the data. And as we've talked about, you know, data as a product, that's a cultural change. I think that is happening within biopharma as well. So people like data custodians are worrying more about that rather than bench scientists. Data scientists who require programmatic access, who do more advanced kind of modeling than the bench scientists do. Again, their concerns are different. They're thinking about meta-analysis. They're thinking about data at scale, which is not something that bench scientists are doing. And then again, leadership, whose goal is to potentially monetize data, or if not, at least look at what is happening, right, and follow that trajectory. And fair data requirement is across all of this value chain for different reasons, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the case study when we get there. If we could move forward. Preclinical data can be fairly diverse, and throughput can also vary. So, I mean, both the complexity of the data as well as the throughput can vary a fair bit. We have categorized these three data forms in terms of in-house, CRO, and collaborator, and that's not a strict line. Of course, as you would understand, it would depend upon the specific platform of the company, their specialty. But this is in general something that we see. So throughput, goes down with more complex data types like transcriptomics data. But then again, those data types are more complex. In vitro studies are typically the ones that have most throughput. The data is simpler, but because the throughput is higher, metadata management can be much harder. In our case study, we'll touch upon one such example. So if we can move forward to the next one. So this is one example, and again, it's a fairly simplified example, and you can imagine more complex scenarios. But in this particular example, we imagine a company where experiments are being done on this is one particular kind of experiment, and there are many such kind of experiments being done. If there is no platform is in place, the most of the data exists in the raw count XLX, and funny as it is, the name of the file that we have used is as indicative of the file names and how metadata is stored over time. It's almost as simple and as untraceable. And then if you do want to go back to and look at something, it's incredibly hard. And also because you don't have a platform, simple report generation can take a lot of time. It's not just a question of post facto analysis of what is going to happen in a year, but even the first cut analysis can take a lot of time if there is no data platform in place, because just moving the data from place to another, connecting these pipelines to each other can be very hard, and you cannot make those connections really well until the data is not standardized. And again, just another example of where data standardization or a data platform helps is that if you don't have that in place, even the final sort of insights that you get from, in this case, Prism, which is, let's say a chart, they can be very difficult to compare across two different experiments, two different individuals, from the same lab. And on the next slide, we talk about, what are these challenges? How are they influencing ROI? So first of all, manual wrangling takes a lot of time and person hours, and it's not just counted in terms of the number of hours spent doing that, but there's often a lag because people are doing other things. It's hard to connect pipelines and automate them if there is no data platform, if there is no data standardization. There are dependencies on individuals. Different individuals tend to capture data and metadata differently, process it differently. Again, that makes any kind of comparison very, very hard. And any kind of forward-looking vision, which is something that, as we have talked about as part of this conversation, that machine learning and really approaches at scale are becoming more and more important when looking at data. They are almost impossible to do if ab initio structure is not put in place to capture data, to standardize those kind of pipelines. So with that, I will hand it over to Krutika for the next part of the conversation.
Thanks, Swetabh. And the other, the solution that we propose here is a data-centric platform. And here the data is not only stored, but enhanced via curation and providing a fair data management system so that we can enable the consumption for all stakeholders. But to implement the data-centric approach, there are 3 key steps that need to be focused on. The first would be ingestion, basically to identify and develop and maintain scalable and reproducible ETL pipelines to standardize the data type. So it's the most consumable file format, and also harmonize metadata by adding on domain level experts to the curation process And the second step would be to clean and link the data in a cloud infrastructure so that you can scale the data as well as analysis and provide access and reuse to key stakeholders while also implementing control of access to the platform. And eventually with this 2 steps, the data journey would conclude in consumption via tools like Spotfire and third-party tools that users and stakeholders are already comfortable using. And we've done this or implemented this data-centric approach on our platform, Poly, which I have shown a description here, where different diverse data types are ingested either through in-house or through CROs. And all the data types go through 2 steps, data engineering and metadata harmonization, so that standardized data schema is enforced, as well as there's consistent data formats, file naming convention, and access in a centralized repository, which we call an atlas. And because of the standardized, curated data management system that implements FAIR principles, it allows the consumption through both programmatic access and the UI, depending on what the stakeholders are most comfortable with, and also allows easier integration through code-first approach to different BI tools like Spotfire, Tableau, as well as applications and packages that are useful for the analysis. And since the data-centric platform is geared towards consumption and making the data set available and accessible for the stakeholders, we also have different ways to visualize and explore data by providing easier search functionalities, easier way to integrate to tools that you can use to actually derive insights and compare experiments that are useful in a way that you can't do without a platform or in conventional methods. And in today's demo, we're talking about drug screening that was done for a customer. And there we're going to talk about the UI, the search functionalities, as well as consumption through Spotfire. So this is the UI for the Atlas. And you can see this description for each data set. Basically, it's a drug screen data atlas, where we are studying different drugs in different cell lines. And we're capturing the EC50, IC50, and other parameters that are useful for this assay type. And we also have fields which are ontology driven. For example, we have drug and disease, and these are ontology driven and enforced via the schema, mainly because then a user can conveniently search for data sets of interest. So for example, if we are interested in carcinoma data sets, because of the ontology driven search, we'll be able to not only find different types of carcinomas, as we can see 9 here, but also related or subtypes of carcinoma that might be of interest. So you can now select all of the disease types and apply this filter for a quick visualization or overview of different data sets related to carcinomas. And because of the schema, you can also do very complex or logical searches. So we have a lot of data fields here. So we have cell lines, diseases, tissue, data type, data points, as well as the drug. So if I'm trying to find data sets which are specific to bleomycin, but I'm not interested in cell types for melanoma, I can also implement that here. And this will result in 19 data sets, which are related to bleomycin or are studying the bleomycin drug, but none of the cell lines are now melanoma. So this is just how the schema and a platform that enables the search and query of data sets of interest is useful for preclinical terms. And this is all enabled by schema. And the schema can be specifically defined for each data type. So here it's a drug screen. That's why we have EC50s, IC50 values. But for each data type, it would be defined on what is the most useful fields that are used to filter and identify data sets. And we also have programmatic access that I mentioned before, and that is useful when we want to integrate to tools like Spotfire. So here we have retrieved the same data sets that we saw in the atlas before, again with the values related to drug screen, the EC50s, drug sensitivity, cell line and cell type, and disease of interest. And through the curation, as well as the standardization of the data, a stakeholder can provide quick visualization or overview of each of these projects. So in this case, we've plotted the distribution of disease. So the x-axis is the disease type, and y-axis is the number of data sets for each of these experiments. And we can see like most of the data set is melanoma, followed by breast neoplasm. And these are consistently named and annotated following the mesh ontology. So you can be sure that all the data sets which are breast cancer are now annotated with breast neoplasms and now are getting captured in this overview. And similarly, you can also do visualization or overviews of different fields so that you can get an overview of how many cell lines are used per disease, as well as what's the distribution of the drugs that are studied. And this is just an overview of the metadata, but the most essential part of any data is actually doing the analysis. And the status quo, or the traditional way to do the curve fitting, would be to open a file from your plate reader in Prism, do normalization, and then identify or plot the curve. But since we've automated this process and we've captured all the information at metadata level as well as data set level, we are able to plot not only one data experiment, but we can also plot multiple experiments here, which allows for quicker throughput and report generation for each experiment that you're looking at without doing the manual process of clicking on normalization and plotting the curve that you would do on Prism. And this whole process of data standardization, enforcing the schema, and also providing such convenient ways to consume the data actually affects the ROI as well. In this case, we did see drastically reduced turnaround times for analysis. Poly was able to provide the standardization and consumption of the data such that multiple experiments could now be visualized like we did in Spotfire, where earlier it would be a manual process of opening a file and doing all that process for one data set at a time. But now it's been accelerated for doing multiple and complex searches of data sets. So that's how the time has been reduced to approximately 25x. And now the data is fair, accessible, and reusable for all the stakeholders. And because of the automation of ingestion and the analysis, it's also increased the traceability and reliability of the data that is produced for all the stakeholders. And this platform is built for preclinical teams. Mainly because we have the curation and metadata harmonization and consumption methods, but it's also essential to take care of the data governance, security, and scalability of the data. So through a platform like ours, we are able to provide bespoke solutions to remove or reduce data silos, enforce schema, and provide access to diverse data types in one platform, as well as supporting the consumption methods for those data types. And because the platform is on the cloud, we can enable security, enable access control, as well as provide scalable infrastructure to scale up or scale down as required for each data type. And making preclinical data management a reality takes a lot of effort and time, mainly by hiring the correct talent pool, as well as implementing and maintaining the infrastructure to scale up. The platform allows users and preclinical teams to actually focus on things that they are interested in, for example, like insight generation, testing, collaborating, and developing treatments of our patients, instead of focusing on the ETL pipelines or infrastructure that might affect timelines and budget for the organization. Great, and that is the end of our talk. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk about the data management solutions. We are open for any questions, if there are any.
Thank you, Krutika, and Swetabh, thank you as well. So we actually have several questions for you. You might want to take out your pencil and write these down. I'll just go down the list and then you can answer them in the best order that you see fit. So the first question is, do you have data access controls and versioning on the platform? That would be question one. Question two is, what's the metadata curation process? What does that look like?
Mm-hmm.
Third question is, can we access public data that complements preclinical data on the platform? Why don't we answer those three and then we'll go through the rest.
Great. Yeah, we do have access control. It's team-based access control. So those could be teams within your organization or outside collaborators. And that access control is at dataset level, as well as some of the consumption layers. So you can share analysis just to view to a customer or a stakeholder, or they could also collaborate and write and edit that analysis or data. So we have those levels of access. In terms of curation, so we do have a very comprehensive process for curation. It first has the manual process, which is double-blinded. So we can identify the test data set, which is manually curated and is very high quality. And when we have enough data sets to build a model, the model is developed to automate the curation process.
Right. And then what about accessing public data that complements preclinical?
Right. Yeah. So we do have ways to augment the preclinical data sets with public data. We have around 3 million data sets on the platform from various different sources like Geo, TCGA, CBI portal. So any data set of interest in the public domain can be accessed and used to augment the insights.
Excellent. Now, in your opinion, guys, who are the stakeholders that should be involved in deciding the data management platform and practices?
Maybe I can answer that. So I think I think there are two kinds of stakeholders broadly. One are sort of the direct consumers of the data, and these are bench scientists or these are data scientists typically who are consuming this data and trying to get insights, or research leaders, and we see them very closely involved. But increasingly, we are also seeing digital transformation teams or IT teams who think about the long-term legacy of the data and the data as a valuable resource in the long term get involved as well. So I think we think that increasingly it's a more complex process, which does not only involve the direct consumers of the data, but people who have a more long-term horizon point of view in mind.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So speaking of the more generic side of things, regarding security, what would you say are the security concerns to be aware of when you're adopting a cloud platform?
So, I mean, I think earlier in this conversation as well, or earlier in this conference as well, we were talking about, the security is really an important asset when you think about any kind of cloud platform. But, I think typically customers should look at the kind of compliances that are there, the kind of policies that are in place, and the track record. For example, we have invested a lot into SOC 2 compliance, which is one of the highest kind of compliances that is out there, or being considered a well-architected platform by AWS is another sort of milestone in that journey. So, the security has to be looked at both the sort of the cloud level as well as the physical asset level of who has access to data and what do they do with it.
Right. Okay, super. We've got one more question here. Is it possible for one platform to meet the requirements for data management, analysis, as well as running all the trainings and machine learning? Can one platform handle all that? Or do you have to do a best of breed?
I think Krutika showed some examples of why we believe that that you need multiple platforms in some way. Data management itself is a big enough challenge, data and metadata management, that you need something. But for example, we showed something like Spotfire, which is great for visualizing your data. And if you were to do more advanced machine learning, you would want to use, for example, our friend from AWS covered something like SageMaker. So typically we don't see one platform working for all of these concerns. It's a combination of these that typically works, and according to us, that's the way to go. Got it.
Okay. Then last question before we wrap up. In your opinions, what are the major bottlenecks in data management, and how do we address them today?
Krutika, do you want to take that?
Yeah. So the major bottlenecks is mainly driven by fit for purpose kind of solutions. That when you have 10 data sets, you figure out a way to handle that data set where it doesn't scale up to, when there's like thousands of data sets coming in every week. So that's a bottleneck. There's no like a data plan or, process in place so that you think about scalability. And that's why now there are like digital transformation teams in a lot of our biopharma companies, which is commendable and appreciated. But that's the main bottleneck. And then the other part is like allowing users to consume the data. So every user has a specific way to consume the data, and they really like feel strongly about it. But there's also constraints on like, is it scalable? Is it reproducible, traceable? So those are some of the concerns and bottleneck on data management.
Sure. Okay, well, that's very good presentation. Thanks to you both, Krutika and Swetabh.